Welcome back to The Deep Dive. We're the show that, tries to cut through the noise and really get to the heart of the latest research.
Exactly. And today we're tackling something pretty fascinating and honestly a bit complex.
Yeah, it's about the journey of new medicines, especially for tough-to-treat cancers. It's rarely simple, is it?
Not at all. And today's focus really shows that. We're looking at non-small cell lung cancer, NSCLC, but a very specific kind.
Right, the one with that genetic marker, the EGFR exon 20 insertion, or X20ins, I think they call it.
That's the one, X20ins, a notoriously difficult subtype to manage. We'll definitely unpack why.
Okay, so our mission today isn't just about reporting results from this big phase 3 trial, EXCLAIM 2.
No, we want to go deeper, pull it apart, really.
Yeah, figure out what this, well, frankly, surprising outcome means. For patients, obviously, but also for drug development, how these things get approved. The whole process.
This trial, EXCLAIM 2, it compared a new oral drug, Mobocertinib, against the standard chemotherapy, but as a first treatment option.
And we're basing this all directly on the published results, right? From the Journal of Clinical Oncology.
Correct. The full paper and a really good editorial piece that came with it gives us a lot to chew on.
Okay, so before we get into the trial itself, let's set the stage. Why is this specific cancer, EGFR exon 20 insertion NSCLC, such a challenge? What makes it so tricky?
Well, EGFR mutations generally are key drivers in lung cancer, but these exon 20 insertions, they're different. They're less common, maybe 6 to 12% of all EGFR cases.
Okay.
And the big problem was the drugs that worked really well for other EGFR mutations, those first and second gen TKIs, tyrosine kinase inhibitors, they just didn't cut it here.
It didn't work well. How badly?
Really poorly. Response rates were tiny, like maybe 10%, and patients only benefited for like 1 to 3 months before the cancer started growing again. Progression-free survival was very short.
Wow, 1 to 3 months, that's barely any time.
Exactly. It's devastating. So targeted therapy wasn't really working out.
So what was the standard first option then, if those targeted drugs weren't effective?
For first line, it was basically platinum-based chemotherapy. Good old chemo.
And how well did that work?
I mean, it worked, but median progression-free survival was historically around, say, 5.6 to 7.1 months in trials, maybe even a bit less in the real world, like 4 to 6 months.
Still not great.
No. So you can see there was this huge unmet need. Patients needed something better, something targeted.
Okay, and that's where Mobocertinib comes in. It sounds like it was designed specifically for this gap.
Precisely. It was developed as a first-in-class oral TKI designed to hit these specific exon 20 insertion mutations. There was a lot of hope riding on it.
And it even got an early nod from regulators, right? Accelerated approval.
It did, yeah. FDA accelerated approval in September 2021 and approvals elsewhere too. But, and this is key, that was for patients whose cancer had already progressed after chemo.
So second line or later.
Exactly. Based on an earlier phase 3 study that looked promising, it showed a median PFS of about 7.3 months in those patients who'd already had chemo.
7.3 months after chemo.
Oh, okay.
So EXCLAIM 2 was meant to be the big confirmation, but for first-line use this time.
That's right. It was the confirmatory trial needed to potentially solidify that approval and maybe move it into the first-line setting.
Okay, let's get into EXCLAIM 2 then. How was it set up?
So it was a big global phase 3 study, open label, so patients and doctors knew who was getting what.
But the results were checked independently.
Yes, tumor scans were read by a blinded independent central review, or BICR. That keeps it objective.
Makes sense. And who are the patients?
Patients with advanced or metastatic EGFR X20ins NSCLC who hadn't had any prior treatment. So truly first line, they were randomized 1-to-1.
One group got Mobocertinib?
Yep, 160 milligrams once a day, orally.
And the other?
Standard platinum-based chemo, usually Pemetrexed, plus either cisplatin or carboplatin, the standard of care.
How many people were in the study?
Quite a few. 354 patients were randomized overall. About half in each group, 179 on mobocertinib, 175 on chemo.
And they tried to balance the groups.
Yeah, they stratified by things that could affect outcomes, like whether patients had brain mets, and also by race.
Was there any option for patients on chemo if their cancer progressed? Could they get Mobocertinib later?
Yes, that was built in. Patients in the chemo arm whose disease progressed could cross over and receive mobocertinib if they were still eligible. That's pretty standard ethically.
Okay, so the main goal, the primary endpoint, that was progression-free survival, looked at by that independent review.
Correct. PFS by BICR. That was the main thing they were measuring.
And statistically, what were they looking for? How much better did Mobocertinib need to be?
Well, The trial was powered to detect a significant improvement, aiming for something like a 3.5-month median PFS benefit for mobocertinib. But they also planned this interim analysis.
A check-in point.
Exactly, and crucially, they had a rule. If at that check-in, the hazard ratio, which compares the rates of progression, was greater than 1, suggesting mobocertinib wasn't doing better, maybe even worse,
Then they'd stop.
they'd stop the trial for futility. It basically means, look, it's highly unlikely this drug is going to prove superior if we continue, so it's better to stop now.
That's a high bar. So this preset futility boundary, it's like a scientific safety switch.
You could think of it that way, yeah. A pre-agreed point where you say, okay, this isn't working out as hoped. It really sets the stage for the actual result.
Okay, the stage is definitely set. Promising drug, specific target, big confirmatory trial, high hopes for a first-line option. This is it. What did EXCLAIM 2 find?
Well, this is where things took a really unexpected turn for many people.
Don't keep us in suspense.
Okay. So at that planned interim analysis, the data cutoff was April 2023. The median progression-free survival by that independent review was 9.6 months.
9.6 months. Okay, is that good? Bad? How does it compare?
Here's the kicker. It was 9.6 months in both arms.
Wait, what? 9.6 for mobocertinib
Yeah.
and 9.6 for chemo. Exactly the same.
Exactly the same median PFS. Astonishing, really.
Wow. After everything. The specific design, the earlier promise. What was your first thought seeing that?
Yeah, definitely surprising, especially given that 7.3 months number in the second-line setting. And the crucial part, statistically, the hazard ratio was 1.04.
And 1.04 is?
It's greater than 1. It meant the trial crossed that pre-specified futility boundary we just talked about.
So the safety switch got flipped.
Essentially, yes. The Independent Data Monitoring Committee looked at this and concluded mobocertinib was not superior to chemo for first-line treatment.
And the immediate result was they stopped the trial early.
They did. The study was discontinued prematurely based on that finding.
Which is huge. And what did that mean for the drug itself, the one that already had accelerated approval?
Well, the direct consequence was that Takeda, the company making it, voluntarily withdrew all the marketing authorizations for mobocertinib across the globe.
Wow. Because this trial didn't deliver the confirmation needed.
Exactly. It didn't meet the regulatory requirements tied to those accelerated and conditional approvals.
Okay, 9.6 months. For both. Just let that sink in. A drug designed for a specific target, already showing promise later on, doesn't beat standard chemo first line. It's like you said, not just a setback. It feels like a bombshell.
It really does raise big questions.
Yeah, what does it mean for development, for patients who maybe hoped this was the answer? Where do you even start unpacking that?
Well, I think the first step is to realize that PFS, while it's the primary endpoint, isn't the only thing the trial measured. We need to look at the other data.
Like what? Other signs of efficacy? Patient experience?
Exactly. Things like how many tumors actually shrank, how long those responses lasted, and importantly, how patients felt the quality of life data. Those tell a more nuanced story.
Okay, let's get into that nuance then. Did mobocertinib show any advantage on other efficacy measures?
There were some interesting points. The objective response rate, OR, the percentage of patients whose tumors shrank significantly was actually very similar. 32% for mobocertinib, 30% for chemo.
So about the same chance of initial shrinkage.
Pretty much. But, and this is where you said it gets really interesting.
Right, the duration of response. How long did the benefit last if you responded?
Yes, exactly. And here, mobocertinib looked better. The median duration of response was notably longer, 12.0 months with mobocertinib compared to 8.4 months with chemotherapy.
12 months versus 8.5. That's a real difference.
It is. And it also seemed to work faster. The median time to response was quicker with mobocertinib 1.5 months versus almost 3 months, 2.8 for chemo.
So similar initial hit rate, but faster action and longer lasting benefit for those who did respond. That sounds clinically meaningful.
It certainly could be for individual patients, yeah.
What about the ultimate endpoint, overall survival? Any difference there yet?
At this interim point, the data was still immature. Median OS for mobocertinib wasn't reached yet, not estimable versus 30 months for chemo, but the survival curves looked very similar at 2 and 3 years, so no clear OS difference detected yet.
Okay, what about the patient's experience? The quality of life side? Did mobocertinib make people feel better symptom-wise?
That's a really important angle, and yes, there were some signals there. Mobocertinib showed clinically meaningful delays in the time it took for lung cancer symptoms like cough, shortness of breath, chest pain to get worse compared to chemo,
Okay, that's significant.
and also for cognitive function, which is interesting. Plus, specifically, time to worsening of constipation was longer with mobocertinib, so a different symptom profile, potentially better in some ways.
But there's always a but, isn't there? What were the trade-offs? Where did mobocertinib cause more problems?
Exactly. The big one was diarrhea. It was associated with earlier worsening of diarrhea. And it was incredibly common. 96% of patients had some, and 20%, 1 in 5, had severe grade 3 or higher diarrhea.
Oof, 96%. That's almost everyone. And severe in 20%. That really impacts daily life.
Hugely. It also led to earlier worsening of appetite loss compared to chemo. So you trade some chemo side effects for some potentially very troublesome TKI side effects.
How did the overall safety look? Were people stopping treatment because of side effects at similar rates?
Overall, the rates of stopping treatment due to side effects were actually pretty similar, around 18% for mobocertinib, 20% for chemo. But how the side effects were managed and what they were differed a lot.
Can you break that down? What were the main issues for each?
Sure. With mobocertinib, besides diarrhea, you saw a lot of paronychia, that's inflammation around the nails common with these drugs, plus decreased appetite and stomatitis, mouth sores. This meant doctors had to adjust the dose more often. Lots more dose interruptions or reductions needed to manage things.
So more intensive management required for mobocertinib side effects. What about chemo?
Chemo had more of the classic side effects. Constipation was actually higher than diarrhea, plus nausea, anemia, and myelosuppression drops in blood counts, like neutrophils. This led to more frequent delays in treatment cycles.
Different patterns of toxicity needing different management strategies. Any difference in treatment-related deaths?
There were no treatment-related deaths reported in the mobocertinib arm compared to one in the chemotherapy arm.
Okay, so even with the same 9.6-month PFS, the journey for the patient looks quite different depending on the treatment arm. One path has maybe chronic diarrhea, nail issues. The other has maybe fatigue, nausea, blood count issues.
Precisely. It really underlines that one number, like median PFS, doesn't tell the whole story. The patient experience, the side effect burden, the duration of benefit if you respond, it's all part of the picture.
Which makes judging success or failure much more complicated.
Absolutely.
So let's think bigger picture. Why did the chemo arm do so well here? 9.6 months seems maybe better than those historical numbers you mentioned earlier.
That's a great question, and the study authors touch on it. It could be that in a well-run clinical trial setting, doctors get really good at managing chemotherapy side effects, allowing patients to stay on treatment longer and at higher doses, what they call high relative dose intensity.
So maybe modern supportive care and trials makes chemo perform better than it did years ago.
That's definitely possible. Plus, trial populations can be different from real-world patients. It's always tricky comparing across studies.
But it's important to remember mobocertinib did still show activity, right? 9.6 months isn't nothing.
Absolutely not. In fact, that 9.6 months in EXCLAIM 2, first line, was actually longer than the 7.3 months it showed in the earlier study for patients who'd already had chemo.
Huh, interesting.
And it was certainly better than what you'd expect from those older first-gen EGFR drugs if you tried to use them for this mutation first line. So the drug clearly has biological activity. It just didn't beat modern first-line chemo head-to-head in this trial design.
Which brings us back to trial design. You mentioned EXCLAIM 2 was mobocertinib alone versus chemo alone, but wasn't there another big trial, Papillon, for a different drug in the same setting that did show a benefit? How was that different?
Yes, that's a critical comparison. Papillon tested a drug called amivantamab, also for first-line EGFR X20Ns. But the design was different. It tested amivantamab plus chemotherapy versus chemotherapy alone.
Ah, a combination approach.
Exactly. And that combination significantly improved PFS. It was 11.4 months for the combo versus 6.7 months for chemo alone in that trial.
Wow, okay, so adding the targeted drug to chemo worked, whereas swapping it for chemo didn't, at least not for mobocertinib.
That seems to be the lesson here. It really highlights how crucial the trial design is, especially for these confirmatory studies after accelerated approval. You have to think hard about the best strategy, monotherapy, combination, the comparator arm.
It makes you wonder, could mobocertinib plus chemo have worked?
It's a fair question, but one EXCLAIM 2 wasn't designed to answer. It really underscores the complexity of proving benefit.
So where does this leave patients with this mutation? Mobocertinib is withdrawn. Is the field back to square one?
Not entirely back to square one, but the unmet need definitely persists. This outcome is a setback, no question, but research hasn't stopped.
Are there other drugs in the pipeline?
Yes, thankfully. There are other EGFR TKIs specifically targeting exon 20 insertions still in clinical trials, drugs like Mobocertinib, Zipilertinib, or IC114, maybe others too. So hope isn't lost. New options might still emerge.
It's ongoing effort then.
Definitely. It's a challenging space, but progress is still being made, even if it's not always linear.
Okay, well that brings us toward the end of this deep dive. It's been quite a journey through the EXCLAIM 2 trial. The headline finding is clear. Mobocertinib didn't beat chemo first line for EGFR exon 20 NSCLC based on PFS, leading to its withdrawal.
Right. But as we've discussed, the story underneath is richer. There were those interesting signals in duration of response, time to response, and some quality of life aspects balanced against a different and sometimes difficult side effect profile.
It really highlights that complexity. A single number doesn't capture everything.
No, it doesn't. And it reminds us that even trials that don't meet their primary endpoint can teach us a lot.
Absolutely. And maybe the final thought to leave everyone with is about this balancing act. We have these accelerated approval pathways to get promising drugs to patients faster, which is great. But then you have the rigorous demand of these big confirmatory trials.
And how do you measure success? Is it just the primary endpoint, the PFS? Or do things like response duration, symptom control, quality of life? How much weight should they carry, especially if the main endpoint isn't met?
Yeah, how do we collectively, doctors, patients, regulators, society, weigh all these different factors? Especially when, as EXCLAIM 2 shows, the path for new treatments is often winding and sometimes leads to unexpected places.
It's a tough question with no easy answers.
It really is, something that requires ongoing discussion and learning.